Welcome to today's Explainer. We are jumping right into one of the most fascinating and honestly consequential puzzles in modern policy. It's a topic that is constantly dominating the headlines: tariffs. Do tariffs actually cause wars? And will the latest U.S. tariffs trigger one? We're unpacking the massive paradox of protectionism. Basically, we're looking at the huge glaring gap between the political popularity of tariffs and the overwhelming consensus among economists that they are incredibly dangerous. So why exactly do politicians love a policy that economists absolutely hate? Well, we have to acknowledge the emotional appeal here, right? On the surface, it feels totally intuitive. If a factory in your hometown is struggling against cheaper foreign goods, slapping a tax on those imports seems like a perfect shield. It's an emotionally resonant promise to protect domestic jobs. But before we dismantle that myth, we've got to realize why politicians across the spectrum keep going back to this well. It just sounds like an easy fix to a really complex problem. Okay, let's dive into this real quick just to establish a baseline. What is a tariff exactly? It is simply a tax or duty paid on a particular class of imports or exports. When a government imposes a tariff, they aren't forcing a foreign government to write them a check. No way. They're applying a tax at the border, which almost always means that extra cost gets passed straight down to you, the domestic consumer. It is essentially a domestic tax on imported goods. Section 1. History's Warning, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff. To see how this plays out in the real world, we really just need to step back into the 1930s. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was this famous protectionist policy meant to shield American farmers and workers during an economic downturn. Look at the timeline. In 1929, the stock market crashes. By June 1930, trying to stop the bleeding, the government passes Smoot-Hawley, jacking up import duties to record highs. Now, if the theory worked, unemployment should have stabilized, right? Instead, by 1931, it shot up to 15%. By 1932, a staggering 26%. Trying to save jobs actually deepened the Great Depression. 1,000. That is how many leading economists from universities all across the country signed a desperate petition begging President Hoover to veto the bill. They explicitly warned him, you simply cannot increase employment by restricting trade, and other nations are definitely going to retaliate. But those warnings, they were completely ignored for the sake of political expediency. Which brings us to the harsh contrast between myth and reality. The myth sold to the public was that tariffs increase employment by keeping foreign goods out. But the reality, just like those 1,000 economists predicted, was swift, brutal global retaliation. Other countries immediately threw up their own tariffs against American goods. The result? By 1933, world exports had plummeted to just 1/3 of what they were in 1929. By trying to lock others out, nations locked themselves into a devastating global freeze. Section 2. Domestic strife and division, pitting neighbor against neighbor. You know, the friction caused by tariffs doesn't just stop at international borders. Let's shift back even further to the 1820s to see how these policies can tear a nation apart from the inside. Alexis de Tocqueville, the famous French political thinker, hit the nail on the head when observing the American nullification crisis, a time when a state literally threatened to ignore federal trade law. He said the tariff was the sole source of the political animosities which agitated the Union. See, tariffs were set up to protect northern manufacturing, but the agricultural South, which relied on exporting crops and buying cheap imports, suffered immensely. It fueled intense, bitter division between the two regions. Section 3. The Macroeconomic Reality, Modern Data and Recent Shocks. Let's fast forward and see how this builds into our modern world. We aren't just relying on history here. We've got incredibly robust, present-day data. Recent macroeconomic studies looked at 151 different countries over 50 years, and the picture is crystal clear. Recently, the U.S. statutory trade-weighted tariff rate, basically the average tax on imports by law, has spiked to 27.4%. To put that into perspective, that is the highest level we have seen since the late 1930s. Impartially speaking, across different recent administrations, we are witnessing a historic resurgence in using tariffs as a primary tool, completely ignoring the historical warnings. So what actually happens to an economy when these rates spike? Well, the outcomes are universally negative. Output declines, productivity declines, unemployment, ironically, it increases, and economic inequality goes up too. Across the board, empirical data proves that tariff increases consistently harm the exact domestic economy they are supposedly designed to protect. It all comes down to a domino effect of unintended consequences. First off,
domestic consumers inevitably pay higher prices at the store. Second, just like the 1930s, export industries get crushed by foreign retaliation. Third, employment artificially shifts to less productive sectors that only survive because of government shielding. And finally, the true cost of the whole shebang is borne by the public, not the foreign nations being targeted. Section 4. Seeds of Global Conflict. From Economics to Geopolitics.
The costs of protectionism aren't just measured in dollars, cents, or unemployment lines. The ultimate, most chilling cost is the shift from economic friction straight into geopolitical hostility. Because when goods stop crossing borders, tensions usually start crossing them instead. Economists call this beggar thy neighbor. It is basically when a country tries to fix its own problems by making things worse for everyone else. You throw up a tariff, it hurts your trading partner, they retaliate with their own, and suddenly international trade turns from a mutually beneficial system into a hostile, losing game where trust just completely evaporates.
The Nobel laureate Milton Friedman explained this danger brilliantly. In a free market, trade is peaceful, it's voluntary. But the second a government intervenes with tariffs, trade gets forcefully politicized. Private business disputes suddenly escalate into high-stakes conflicts between entire governments. Like Friedman said, when tariffs are in play, conflict, not cooperation, becomes the overriding rule.
And that conflict can escalate way beyond diplomatic arguing. The macroeconomic research highlights a truly sobering finding. Historians and economists widely view the massive global trade shrinkage in the early 1930s, driven by protective tariffs like Smoot-Hawley, as a plausible seed of World War II. By cutting off peaceful economic ties, nations became isolated, desperate, and deeply antagonistic toward one another.
Which leaves us with one final lingering question. We've seen that tariffs deepen depressions, divide nations internally, shrink economies, raise prices, and literally pave the way for global wars. If the evidence is so universally clear, why do politicians across the entire spectrum continue to use them today? It is a dangerous political paradox, and honestly, it's one we cannot afford to ignore.